All right. So this evening, I guess we can say we're going off script. It's technically scripted because I came up with it, so it's on script for me. But we are kind of going into what we usually would consider unexplored territory in the churches of Christ. Because tonight we're going to be talking about the Maccabees. And it's going to be our final little snippet of this mini series on the return from exile. Picking up where we were last week in Esther, we had the Persian Empire, which of course spanned most of the Middle East at the time, and it can be defined as it was a more lenient occupying force than the others. But as we saw a couple weeks ago in our study of Daniel, what we had is this prophecy of there would be a force, this goat that would come and destroy the ram, and that goat was to be represented as Alexander the Great. And so Alexander the Great comes from Macedonia, which is Greece, and leads an expansionary campaign in which he is pushing the Persians back, and eventually becomes pretty much everything Persia had became Greek. And that's where we start to see a lot of that's why Greek languages started happening. They built libraries, they built all sorts of things that kind of influenced our biblical world. But then, of course, Alexander, as they're still technically on the campaign, he's making a push towards the Indus River Valley. He becomes sick. Some make the joke that it's because he was poisoned, and so that's why he's died. Some say people stabbed him. Some people say it was a general who was ready to become king stabbed him. But that's not quite. We're not quite certain because everyone has a different story. However, what we do know is after Alexander the Great dies, the Greek Empire really divides into four main clusters. You have the Seleucids, the Ptolemaic, and the kingdom of Lysimachus and Cassander. Cassander is Alexander's heir, but these other three are generals that have worked their way up and were able to claim a title. However, where the Maccabees begin is we have the Seleucids are making their campaign and expanding their growth. What they're beginning is what's considered the Syrian Wars, and they are beginning to invade what is Israel, and they're pushing down into Egypt because, of course, when you have four kings over the same area and they're trying to work together, there's one king who wants to be king of all of it and not just share in the glory. Because even if we look at the map, Cassander has come up and destroyed Licariot, what is his name? Lysimachus. And so that brings us to the Maccabees. I don't know why it changed it, but we're starting in First Maccabees, and where am I? Okay. And so Maccabees opens with kind of laying the groundwork. It goes through the whole history of Alexander, and it's in like 36 verses. And they're like, all right, here's everything that has happened since Persia, which I did in 5 minutes. So it was a very brief description, but what we see is it opens up and it introduces us into some of the main characters. And one of them is Antiochus Epiphanes. He is the emperor of the Seleucid Empire, and it's describing all of his evils and how he has led the people astray. And it's described in the First Maccabees as this idea of lawlessness, or it's probably more of Torahlessness. It's not just that there was no law; it's not anarchy, but there is a lack of Torah. And we're in the first chapter, you see a lot of these little tidbits show up. They're making covenants with Gentiles. They're selling themselves to do evil. They're building a citadel in Jerusalem. They built a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Antiochus pillages the temple. There's a defiling of the sanctuary. They made themselves as the uncircumcision. Antiochus struck Israel. And then, of course, First Maccabees 1 ends with a decree of corruption, in which he's basically saying those who hold to the law are to be punished. Those who reject the Torah and become like the Greeks, those will be blessed under the Seleucids. And some of these seem kind of odd, especially because our understanding of what a gymnasium is not the same as the Greek understanding of what a gymnasium is. Simple way to put it, they're not wearing clothes when they're working out, and it becomes one of those, it's a form in which you are praising the body, you're praising the physical attributes, which under the Torah you're not supposed to do. The idea is, the idea is the flesh is evil, the human nature is bad, God is the only thing that's good. And we kind of see that in the church too, is we don't want to praise the physical too much because that's not the good part of us. It's the physical part of us leads us to sin. And likewise, we're kind of seeing that here in the Maccabees. Another part is they built a citadel. And you may think, oh, it's just a citadel. They're making it into a fortress. But it was one of those moments in which they're stamping this is not a city of God. As we talked about when we were going through the Kings and Prophets back in the fall, Jerusalem was defined by the temple. And so it was a temple, or the city was built around the temple. It was marked as this is God's city. This is the holy city. And then we saw it in Jeremiah too, of that was one of the things that it got so hard for them to let go of. Well, why would God destroy Jerusalem? It's God's city. It's God's temple. But now instead the Greeks have built a citadel and they're putting their stamp on it and saying, yeah, there's a temple to God, but that doesn't mean anything. We're going to erect our idols in the temple, and we're going to build a citadel, and we're going to mark this city as a Greek city. This is going to be a Greek place. This is where the Greeks will be. And I want to include this part from chapter 2. We get introduced to Matthias, and he is the father of the five sons, but his most notable is his third son, Judas Maccabeus, which is what, of course, the book of Maccabees is named after. It's the Maccabean revolt which is kind of weird to think because he's not the one to start it. He's just the one to be the main guy to fight it. But Matthias opens up and says, alas, why was I born to see the ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live when it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens. Her temple has become like a person without honor. Her glorious vessels have been carried into exile. Her infants have been killed in the streets, her youth by the swords into the foe. What nation has not inherited her palaces and has not seized her spoils? All her adornment has been taken away. No longer free, she has become a slave. And see, our holy place, our beauty and our glory have been laid to waste. The Gentiles have profaned them. Why should we live any longer? Now, Matthias is crying out in the context of First Maccabees. The chapter 1 ends with this decree of corruption. You are to do Torah, or not do Torah. You're to do the things against Torah. You're to embrace this. But chapter 2 opens up, and Matthias is coming up from one of the neighboring cities of Jerusalem, and he's seeing the statue to Zeus that has been built in the temple. And he's crying out, this is not the city of God. We have truly fallen. I'm sure we can think of those folks from like the towns outside of in the middle of nowhere, and they go to New York City and they'll say, well, this is not what America is supposed to be. Why are we filling our streets with garbage and there's people sleeping on the ground. Like, this is not the shining city of God that it's supposed to be, or the shining American city. Well, Matthias is kind of having that moment here, and he's like, this is not the capital of my people. This is not where the temple is, and we are disgracing God by doing this. And so the time comes, and there's to be a sacrifice, and the sacrifice is brought on by the Greeks. The Greeks are saying, you need to sacrifice to the idol of Zeus, and we will have one of you Jews who have forsaken your God make this sacrifice. And of course, Matthias is there in the city. He's watching this, and he's with his sons. And it's kind of like that clip from 300, where he cries out, "This is Sparta." This is kind of the Bible's version, or the Jews' version of this, because Matthias stands up and strikes down this Jew who had become an apostate, and he was going to make the sacrifice, and he strikes him down in front of everyone and says, "My sons, my brothers, and I will continue in the covenant of our fathers. Far be it for us to forsake the law and ordinances. We will not obey the words of the king to turn aside from the worship to the right and to the left." And he goes on more, but this part stood out to me specifically because it's calling back to Joshua. And that was, of course, earlier on than we had really talked about in our study of Kings and Prophets. But what we saw was Joshua begins and ends with these kind of two parallels, and it's reversed to how Matthias says it. Joshua at the beginning is told, be strong and courageous, do not fear, do not turn to the left or to the right. But Joshua then ends with a rededication moment in which they're making a sacrifices before God, and they're pleading for safety, and they're saying, and Joshua says to the people, we can make these decisions, we will decide, I'm putting it on you, you can decide whether you want to worship God or not, but for me and my household, we will follow the Lord. I'm sure we've seen the signs in people's houses and all of that, and it's probably, there's 20 of them at Hobby Lobby right now that have that saying on it. But Matthias is saying that same thing in this moment in front of the people, and sure, he's probably sounds like the country bumpkin who's coming and he knows better, but what he's doing is reminding the people of, this is clearly wrong. This is against what we have been told. All of the history, all of the laws are built on this idea of you are not to offer to idols what is God's. You are not to turn from the left or to the right to make the law fit whatever you want. There is right and wrong in the eyes of God. You are to follow it, and you may want to go off to sin, but me and my household, I will follow the Lord. And then they begin the revolt, and the next couple chapters are kind of just filling in Matthias's leadership. And again, it was a different text, and so it would all fit on there. But at the end of chapter 2, it says, they took the law out of the hands of the Gentiles and the kings, and they did not allow the sinners to dominate them. I liked that because it clicked. It made sense after we've just finished this study of the kings and the prophets, and we've seen Ezra and Nehemiah, and we've seen Esther, and all of the time they were turning the things of the law over to the Gentiles. They wanted to be like the nations surrounding them. The Jews sought to be like others, even though they were the people of God and called to be different. And so their kings, the sinners of the group, would become focused on managing the law in the way they saw. But the Maccabean revolt is to focus on this idea of the law is God's. And it is not to be in the hands of sinners. It's not to be in the hands of Gentiles. It is God's and God's alone. And of course, then we get the war because we're revolting against Greece. And so we see Judas Maccabeus, he takes charge, which stands out again because He's the third son of five. His older brothers are alive, or we're led to believe that they're alive. And he has great success. It's seeming like one of those stories from, it's similar to the story of David. It's similar to the story of Joshua. It's an almost nobody in terms of national recognition coming to great success, who's leading campaigns. They're outnumbered every time they go up to battle. They only have a few people on horses, where they're fighting Greeks who have war elephants, and it's one of those, they're clearly outmatched in every battle, but they continue to have victories. And one of the things that happens is they come in to the temple, and they clear it out and they reestablish it. And this is where we get Hanukkah from. It's a Jewish holiday emerging from this. It's still a minor holiday everywhere except the Jews in America really like it. And so that's kind of how we have come to know it. But the Jewish holiday is focused on, as they clear out the temple and they get rid of all this stuff, and they're taking over the remnants of what the emperor hadn't sacked from the temple. It's described as he took everything of gold, everything of silver, anything that possibly could have been of value, he stripped from the temple. And so as they're coming in and they're seeing what has been left, and they're tearing out the idols and all this, their first things first is they're lighting the menorah and it's a seven branched light. And it's, at this time, it's not nine, because that's the Hanukkah menorah, but it's a seven branched menorah, and it's, the seven lights are to represent the days of creation. And it's supposed to be one of those things of, it's to be lit for 2 weeks to last the time of purification of the temple. But they get to the oil and they realize, we don't have enough oil because the emperor took it all, or they've used it for the idols. And so we have no oil. They're barely expecting it to last 2 days. But instead it lasts 8 days, which it becomes the 8 days of Hanukkah. But the 8 days is important is because they're also in the middle of a battle at this time. They're not expecting to be able to get more oil the next day when it needs to be refilled. And so when it lasts 8 days and they're able to get the extra oil to where it's purified and all of that, it's significant because it's showing, well, clearly this is an act of God that this candle remained lit for as long as it did. It's an act of God that we saw this prosperity in our revolts. But then Judas kind of gets a little big for his a role, I guess. He begins suffering more and more losses because the Greeks don't like losing. And so they keep sending more and more war elephants and more troops, and they're sweeping through. And Judas is not defeated entirely, but they are they're not sweeping across great swaths of land like they were at the beginning. I guess they're not really swaths of land if they're fighting in what is about the same size of New Jersey. And so it's one of those, I wouldn't say New Jersey is great swaths of land compared to West Texas, where that's some great swaths of land that they're fighting for. But what begins to happen is the Maccabees are actually the reason why Rome gets involved in the Middle East, at least at first. They will eventually get there, but they become more vested in this interest. And part of it's because Judas sends envoys to Rome to help them fight the Greeks. And the reason why is because at this time, it's still the Republic, and so it's not imperial Rome, but they are growing in power. And what they have done is they've conquered Macedonia and the Asian Minor or Antioch kingdom. And so what we're seeing is Rome is that next reasonable ally. We have the Seleucids coming out of what is Babylon and Persia in that area, and they have control of Syria and down into Israel. But we also have the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, and it's one of those, Rome, we need your help in case both of these guys get involved. They're in they're in the sandwich situation that they were back under what was that, King Josiah, when you had Pharaoh Necho in the south, and you had the Assyrians coming in from the north. They're in that same kind of sandwich of, well, we need to find someone to be allies with, and luckily Rome is strong enough to be that ally at this point. But then we get, but then Judas dies, and it's kind of abruptly in the middle of First Maccabees, and that's kind of where all the interesting stuff stops, because and this again stood out to me because it reminded me of that passage at the end of John. When John's finished, it says, and there were several thousands more things that Jesus did, but if we wrote down everything Jesus did, there would not be room on the earth to fill it, to store that volume. I don't know if it was intentionally a reference back to First Maccabees or what, because this did come first, but First Maccabees 9 says, now the acts of Judas were abundant. His wars and brave things he did and his greatness are not recorded, for there were far too many. It's kind of the same thing, but one is much more prideful and brash. One is much more humble. And I think you can say that was the goal of John, or John may not have even been familiar with this line, but it was just one of those kind of, because at the end, I'll talk more about how this kind of is setting the stage for what the New Testament period is looking for when they're saying, oh yeah, Messiah, a deliverer, someone to lead a revolt. They're thinking of Judas Maccabeus, or at least some of them are thinking of back to this. And I think it's interesting to think if John's gospel is ending with, there are so many good things. It wasn't war. It wasn't destruction. It wasn't great victories. It's gentleness. It's kindness. It's peace. That gospel is, there's so much to that we couldn't fill, that there's not enough room to place that in the world. That is a whole lot different to think of than Judas saying, or whoever's writing this, to say, well, yeah, Judas was so great. He won all these battles, but there's too many, so I'm not going to write them all. And so, I don't know. That was just an interesting thing. First Maccabees kind of ends. There's still several more chapters to First Maccabees, but it's not as interesting. It's kind of boring. And it's just saying, yeah, and then he became high priest, and then he became, then so-and-so didn't like him. And that's all it is. The fighting kind of stops, or it's not as interesting as fighting. But First Maccabees 9, Jonathan, the younger brother of Judas, becomes leader. Then Jonathan is named high priest and governor in chapter 10. Chapter 11, Jonathan and what is now the emperor of the Seleucids, Demetrius II. There's a interesting exchange. They're not now allies, because they both still hate each other, but they're not fighting each other. And so that sets up some weird instances. And then First Maccabees 12, Jonathan renews an alliance with Rome and Sparta, and it becomes one of those, Rome, Sparta, now if we are attacked, now we need you even more. It's one of those, keep putting in front of the Romans what is going on in Israel, keep putting it in front of them. And so, because those are the two strongest powers that aren't allied with the Seleucids at this time. And then Simon, the younger brother of both Judas and Jonathan, becomes leader, and he leads an army against Trypho, who's a general who's kind of usurping the power of Demetrius, because Trypho does not like the Jews. And then 14, there's a brief time of peace, and it's described, and it's all good. And then Antiochus VII has now replaced Demetrius, and he's deceived Simon. He calls Simon in, and he's like, all right, I want to make peace. I want to do good. How can we do this? And Simon's like, well, let's meet. And then, of course, there's the stab in the back, and you're like, All right, well, Simon, you could have seen that your enemy still hates you and recognized that, but you didn't. And then John, Simon's son, succeeds him at the end of First Maccabees 16, and is understood that this is a change in the winds. Now there's a strong independent kingdom of Judah or Judea for a time. That doesn't last very long. It's not in any of the Maccabees, but the Seleucids and the Ptolemies become allies, especially as they're once again, and even the remnants of the Antiochian Greeks, they form a last alliance and they come in and subjugate Judah again, which then draws in the Romans, and the Romans come in and sweep across the Middle East, and that's where we pick up. And then they install the Herodians, and the Herodians start doing wonderful things like ordering the death of children because of an angel that comes from, not angels, because the wise men from the east come to them and says there's been a baby born in Bethlehem who's to be king of the Jews. So that's kind of it. But one of the main theme, and each of the Maccabees kind of accomplishes this differently, is there's this idea of order and disorder. You have disorder with the Jews forsaking their Jewishness to be like the Gentiles. You have the temple is being defiled. The Jews are willingly becoming slaves of evil. And then there's what happens in response to that. In First Maccabees, there's not really, kind of like Esther, there's not a visible role of what God's doing. God's not mentioned of hearing a prayer and saying this, or he's not the one giving visions, which is kind of interesting, but it's kind of that same idea of God's still present in all this. We see an Orthodox Jewish family, the Hasmoneans or Maccabeans, lead a revolt to return, throw off the Gentileness, become Jews again. The temple is rededicated with Hanukkah, and the revolution leads Jews out of their self-imposed slavery. And the main point it's pointing to in First Maccabees is God has an active role in delivering his people despite his apparent absence. God isn't really mentioned in First Maccabees. That doesn't mean God is not there and isn't in this role of delivering his people. That leads us kind of into Second Maccabees. Second Maccabees is just a summary of First Maccabees from a different point of view. It's kind of weird. So I'll try and explain it as best I can. If you have any questions, you can stop me whenever. Second Maccabees opens, and it's more like a letter. But it's also a letter that contains letters. So it opens, the first 9 verses of Second Maccabees is a letter from what we can assume is Jews around Jerusalem writing to Jews in Egypt. Jews have of course migrated, and they're under Ptolemaic rule, and they're telling them kind of about this, about what's happened in the temple, this celebration of Hanukkah, and they're encouraging you, if you are struggling in this time, embrace this new tradition, this new celebration of having light in the darkness, having deliverance, having a renewing of your faith before God. Have that celebration, and maybe you will be able to find strength in what you've heard. And then you get a letter to Aristobulus, which is more of that. It's kind of like the difference in First John and Second John. First John, that's really reassuring. It's to a general audience, and the Second John is kind of okay. This is kind of for one person, maybe a handful of people, but I guess you could expand it out, but there's still those things that you're like, that's clearly written to just one person, and John's wanting to make sure he hears it. The same thing here is happening. It's Aristobulus is told, I want you to make sure what you're doing is good, you're maintaining this. And then we get a foreword by the author. The author is very it's different than the author of First Maccabees. All the Maccabees have different authors. They're just considered to be connected because they all are written about the same subject. It's kind of the difference between Kings and Chronicles. They're all written, and you can tell even at certain parts, like the authorship changes just because, well, of course, the scribe died. Scribes don't live for 600 years and to write down all of history, but it's still one of those. They're written by two different authors, but they're written about the same things. And so the author is very conscientious. Like he's very, maybe that's not the right word. He doubts his own abilities. And so I don't think conscientious was even the right word for that. He doubts his own abilities. He's very concerned with, people are going to hate what I wrote. They're going to be like, and so he writes a foreword just saying, okay, this is what I've written this. And then he goes on and he writes a summary of Jason of Cyrene's summary of what Judas Maccabeus does. And so it's very much a like fourth person, like how many people removed are we now getting into this? But there's some weird stories and there's some weird connections that come up later. And so it's weird. But it's, you start to see he's not writing this as a way of telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He's starting to like, there's becoming a mythos around Judas Maccabeus. He's more of a knight in shining armor instead of just a knight. Like it's European knights were not beautiful men who would sweep princesses off their feet. They were gross and they wore metal and they smelled and they're all that. Well, Judas probably smelled and was gross and was always in battle, but he's being made into this knight in shining armor for the Jews. And this summary has kind of three main parts. It opens chapter 3. It describes the evil plot of Simon and the conversions of Heliodrus. Simon was the high priest before any of the high priests mentioned First Maccabees, and so they're putting a lot of blame on this high priest of he's the one to blame for why the Greeks are in Jerusalem and why the Greeks are concerned with the temple, why the Greeks know anything about this. And it's obviously because he had an evil plot. Well, that's not really it. Simon was a high priest and he taught Heliodrus the law. He taught him what it was to be a Jew. Heliodrus goes through the process of becoming not Jewish because it's one of those weird lines of there's an ethnicity, but there's also a religion. And so it's one of those, he becomes a Torah keeper, as Paul would put it. And so he becomes a Torah keeper. Well, then that leads his predecessors to know what the Torah is. And the Jews are saying, well, if the successors of Heliodrus knew what the Torah is, it was clearly because they wanted to tell us to do the things opposite of what's in the Torah. I don't know about that. Sure, you could say that was what's going on. It certainly seems like that, but it's a large leap to make from someone being taught the Torah to it's because they want to destroy the Jews. And so it's one of those, it's a large leap, but again, when you're writing so many different parts away from what's actually happened, the mythos and the fake parts of history kind of seep in a little bit. And then chapters 4 through 10, you get a recap of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, all the terrible things he's done. And then you get, of course, this is the part that's not really included in the First Maccabees. You get the reign of Antiochus V of Eupator in chapters 10 through 15. And then, of course, there's a conclusion in which the author says, I'm sorry, this is all bad, and I didn't do this right, and I feel like I've messed up, and so here you go. And so it's one of those, again, he's not confident in what he's doing and what he's writing, but he is clearly identifying something about the story is important for my Egyptian brothers to know. There's something there. I'll mention this now. Eleazar there's a story of Eleazar In Second Maccabees, it's not really a big deal. Like it's maybe a page and a half as it's described. Like it's a very short snippet of, yeah, Eleazar was a guy and he was righteous and he did good things, and he and his wife and his daughters, they were good Jewish citizens. They were doing the things of the Jews, and this is under Antiochus V. But then they're martyred for the Jewish cause. Antiochus says, we don't like what you're doing. We don't like you being good Jewish examples. We want you to be Gentile. And they're martyred, they're killed. And that's all Second Maccabees writes. I mentioned this because it does come up in Fourth Maccabees, because Fourth Maccabees is weird. But I'll just mention it now. And then we kind of see, again, it's the same story, it's the same idea. There's an idea of disorder and order, but there's a special emphasis because of the context put on this idea of rededication, or especially in the sense of not only the temple being rededicated, but the people being rededicated at this time of Hanukkah. And it's being encouraged that you take this. But Second Maccabees is also written to a different end. Whereas the first one was God is still present in his absence. He's still willing for the liberation of his people in what seems to be a time of silence. Second Maccabees, God is present. God is described as making noise. He's not off in the background pulling the strings. Instead, it's God is taking care of the Jewish people by rewarding those who are faithful to the law or to Torah and punishing evildoers. They're seeing it much more as God is interacting with these people, and they're bringing up those who keep the law, who are rededicating themselves. There are those who are holding on to that, and those who aren't, those who are becoming more like Gentiles, those are the ones being punished by God. And that was Second Maccabees. Third Maccabees is, again, completely different than the other two. And you get a different view. Instead of focusing on the Seleucids, now we're focusing on the Ptolemaic kingdom. This is under Ptolemy the Fourth, also called the Philopater, or the father of love, or love father, or the one who loves his father. You can argue whichever one you want for that one. But it opens and it describes how the Ptolemies went up to war against the Seleucids. And so we're back at before the Maccabees, and this isn't really to have anything to do with the Maccabees itself, but it's describing the same time, the same people. And we're seeing how the Ptolemies harbor this frustration with Jews. They're harboring this frustration because these Jews didn't help us fight the Seleucids, but they also didn't fight against us, but we really wanted them to fight against the Seleucids because we weren't it's one of those, well, we aren't as bad as those guys, but they didn't help us fight off who we think is the bad guy because they don't think either of us are good guys. And so it's one of those, what are you going to do? They're not picking sides, but when they were on your side at the beginning, it's hard to see it as it's not because they dislike you. Anyway, and so what Ptolemy does is he begins to punish the Jews. This quick aside into biblical history, we'll do it now. Well, as part of what Ptolemy does is he rounds up all the Jews and sends them to Alexandria. This will later be important because Alexandria becomes a place of Jewish learning outside of Israel. It's the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, is written in Alexandria because eventually the Ptolemies realize, or a Ptolemy scholar realizes, we're wanting to collect all these great works. And there's this one great work called the Old Testament, as we know it, or the Masoretic text, or the Jewish scriptures. Something is important about this. They're able to recognize this is not like any of the other writings. It is a complete history, but it's also interwoven with their God, and it all makes sense. We need to get this in Greek. We need to get this to where it can be widely understood, because of course, at this point, now you're running up to the issue of there's Jews who know Hebrew and there's Jews who don't know Hebrew, but they know Greek. And so it's one of those issues of, that's why the Septuagint comes forth. It's one of those things of, well, there's all these Jews around Alexandria. They need to have their text in Greek, which they know. So they round up to 70 or 72, depending on how you want to categorize it. And that's how the Septuagint is made. They translate from the Hebrew text into Greek. And but that's just because, that's just an aside. The main thing is Ptolemy rounds up the Jews and puts them in one place. Ptolemy is kind of falling back into that pattern, which is weird to think because he is Greek, but he does claim the title of Pharaoh. And so he's falling into kind of that same story of the Exodus. We have a Pharaoh who's oppressing the Jews, and it's oppression. And so what we see is another Eleazar. Some say it's the same Eleazar from 2nd Maccabees. Some say it's not. That's great. It's hard to tell, especially because since this is not a book that many people have in their Bibles, it's not widely studied, and so it's not widely debated. But it's also one of those, there was how many Judases that were disciples of Jesus? And so like we can guess Eleazar is a common name because it's not like, well, Eleazar is a name that shows up even way back to the sons of Aaron. Like this isn't a new name. And Eleazar comes and he's kind of made out to be like this Moses figure. He's a spokesman for the people of God before the Ptolemies. He's speaking for God. And what ends up happening is Ptolemy is, of course, doing the Pharaoh bit of, no, I won't let the Jews go. I'm not going to let up. And then instead of bringing on 10 plagues, Eleazar calls up to God and 2 angels come down from heaven. And it's described as it began, or it happened, or it was going to happen. It's not quite clear because he stops them before most of the destruction happens, but it happens similar to how there was an angel sent down by God at the end of David's life when David goes up against or makes a census and goes against what God is saying because he's wanting to trust in the human side of it and not on the God side of it. And there's an angel that comes and ravishes the city of Jerusalem. And it's very much similar that was what is supposed to happen in this moment, but it's going to be twice as bad because there's 2 angels. And of course, this leads Ptolemy to have a change of heart. Instead of needing to be taught this lesson 10 times, where his heart is hardened and then it's softened, and then yes, the people can go, no, the people can't go, like we see in Exodus. It's a different twist. It's now I'm going to stop punishing the Jews. I'm going to turn away from this. And that's the 3rd Maccabees. It's again shorter and short. They get shorter and shorter. 4th Maccabees, unlike all of them, they're not telling a story in 4th Maccabees anymore. 4th Maccabees is debating what is more important, what is more significant. The religious teachings of Judaism or Stoicism and Greek philosophy. And it's having kind of this internal debate within itself, focusing on this idea of Eleazar and from 2nd Maccabees. So this is clearly one that is written well after 2nd Maccabees because it has this story. And the whole book is breaking down kind of this debate. And it kind of reminded me of like some of the philosophy papers or exegesis papers like I had to write at LCU or even now in grad school, but it's one of those, you take what was like maybe 2 lines in the Bible and then you have to write 20 pages on it. And just for example of what some of the papers I had to write, one I wrote about that weird passage in Exodus 4 where Moses is being circumcised and the angel, but it's also described as God flees at the sight of the blood of his circumcision. Really weird, but that was one of those like paper topics that, okay, it was assigned and I was like, I can write 15 pages on it, I guess. Was it the greatest one? No, but it's still one of those, clearly the author of Fourth Maccabees is taking that line that didn't make sense, or taking a story that didn't make sense or didn't quite fit to him or to whoever he's writing for, and he's using it as an illustration for why being a good Jew is better than following the Greek philosophies. And Fourth Maccabees is kind of on that line of there are inherent good things that Greek philosophy teaches us. Greek philosophy isn't telling us to throw off everything, but there are things that you also get a whole lot more from the Jewish side that the Greeks kind of forget about. There's an innate sense of morality that the Jews embrace and that sure do, and that is why they're not at each other's throats all the time. Greek philosophy isn't teaching you that. Greek philosophy is not teaching you that good things will lead to good results. There's just you try and do good, and occasionally you'll be rewarded for it. But that's Fourth Maccabees. But I want to finish off tonight's class kind of walking us through kind of some of these steps. In the post-exilic life, again, we're seeing Jews are forsaking their Jewishness, want to be like Gentiles. That leads to the Hasmonean revolt. This leads to the Maccabees. But then that instance leads to Orthodox groups like the Pharisees to emerge in the New Testament era. They look back to the history of the Maccabees and they're saying what it took an Orthodox Jewish family, as someone who held the Torah in high regard, to manage the political and social life of the Jews, to turn them away from Gentileness. We, as the Pharisees, need to be that group for the Jewish people. We need to be the ones to emerge as a political force that, yes, we may be under Rome, but we need to be the ones concerned with the Jews. We need to be the ones that truly have authority over Jewishness. And I think, I know some people have mixed feelings about The Chosen, but one of those first episodes where they're talking about what we need to get, why did I just blank on his name? Nicodemus. We need Nicodemus to give the message because he's a Pharisee and he needs to be the ones to get the Jews in line and stop fishing on the Sabbath. Or if they do, they need to pay taxes to Rome. Well, then you get the whole issue of, was it the Romans or is it the Pharisees? Well, the Pharisees would say, no, we're the ones who have the authority to tell the Jews what to do because we have God on our side. Yes, they should follow Roman law, but really they need to be listening to us, which then becomes the Roman debate of, well, why are we letting the Pharisees govern? Because they're not elected, they're not appointed by Rome, they don't pay taxes to Rome because they're a religious class, and then that becomes a whole deal. But then, okay, so another thing we saw in the post-exile, we see the temple is defiled, the temple becomes less, and that leads to a temple rededication. Well, that leads to the Sadducees. The Sadducees become this wealthy class of elites that, yes, they're Orthodox Jews, but their whole thing is we need to keep the temple and the people pure. And the Pharisees and Sadducees disagree on how to do this and they don't really like each other, but they don't like Rome either. So they'll kind of work together. The Sadducees viewed as we need to go back to Torah and exclusively what Torah teaches. The Pharisees will say, well, the history and the prophets are also good, but some of the prophets we don't believe were true prophets because they're reading some lines way too literally and some too figuratively. And so they're saying, well, just not saying that this is exactly the case, but just to throw one out. Well, Daniel said there was going to be a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. I have yet to see a bear with 3 ribs in his mouth come out of the sea. What? Like, that's not the point of the prophecy that Daniel brought. But it's one of those, there's differences in the two groups, but they kind of are working towards a similar goal. They just disagree on how to get there because they're emerging out of 2 different scenarios. One is the people are forsaking being Jews. So the Pharisees are saying, well, we need to remind them of what it is to be a Jew. And the Sadducees are saying the temple, the religious mechanism that we have has been corrupted. It's been defiled. We need to rededicate. We need to make what we have pure again. But then we see this idea of the Jews becoming slaves to evil. There's this idea of this needs to be resolved by a revolution. And so then they're beginning to expect a new Judas, a new revolt leader, as someone to lead this revolt against Roman oppression in the time of the New Testament, which of course leads us to what we know as the New Testament. That sets the scene for where we are at in the New Testament. And then we get Jesus Christ, and then we see kind of where the church is supposed to fall. But the church has answers to these issues as well. So you have groups of Orthodox Jews that are emerging as political forces. Well, through Jesus Christ, we're taught the church is not supposed to be a political force. I know in America we like to have the church be a political force, and that goes back to even the Catholic Church. The Catholics really wanted the church to be a political force, but the teachings of Christ and then the explanation of the apostles is the Christians are supposed to serve a king, and that king is God. There is not supposed to be a power that they answer to or have more respect to, or are trying to use their influence as Christians to manage. The end goal is not to make every country a Christian nation. It's to make every nation Christian. And so that's kind of the goal of the gospel. But then you see, okay, we have to make the temple pure. We have to make the people pure. Well, baptism is that means in which people are made pure again, in which their sins are washed free, in which you have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. You want a revolution against Roman oppression. Jesus is that Messiah, yes, but the gospel message is leading us to a radically different life. It is the revolution itself. We are not to be worried about the things of the world and physical slavery. We should also be worried about physical slavery. The goal is not a freedom from physical bondage. It is a spiritual bondage, a release from death, a separation from the sin of the world and the oppression that comes with that. I know I kind of sped through some of that, but that's kind of where we're at. And I thought that was a good ending. Do you guys have any questions about the Maccabees, or really anything that we talked about over the past however long? I don't even remember.
Well, we hear references to the book of the Maccabees, I guess, being between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how it was not included in the scripture. And what's the reason for that? Is it clearly something that doesn't seem to be Holy Spirit inspired? Or why do you think it was not included in the scripture?
There's several different reasons, and each book has its own reasons. For example, Fourth Maccabees, very few say it should be included. Like you go to a Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox church, they don't have Fourth Maccabees. It's normally like the Georgian Orthodox Church that it really shows up, and that they're only including it because, well, if there's a first, second, and third, well, we probably should include the fourth as well. Well, the fourth one's excluded because it doesn't really fit with the others. It's kind of more like a paper or a dissertation on philosophy versus religion, and it's not really a message, because you have the main criteria usually is God's role, the people of God's role, what's the end goal, what's the message. And I know for a lot of churches, the Fourth Maccabees is, well, it's pointing you to be a Jew. Well, Paul says not to be a Jew, and to not listen to the Judaizers just because, well, sure, they have the message first. That doesn't mean they're inherently better than you. And then the Third Maccabees, it's not in the Catholic Bibles because you have the Orthodox really like it because it's more of the Orthodox Church. When the church began, there was 5 main churches, and the Orthodox Church had a main church in Alexandria, and so it was one of those. They saw it as this is a history of the people of Alexandria, which becomes the church in Alexandria. And so they're saying God was present in the Church of Alexandria even before it was a church. When it was just a community of Jews, when it was just a community of Jews and Gentiles, God was still present. And so they like that a lot more.
So there are some religions that do include
yes,
the Maccabees
yes,
as spiritual,
yeah,
divine, or
yeah. Like the Catholics have it in their Bibles, and they see it similar to some of those other books like Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah as filling in the gaps of how do we get from we're in exile or we're going into exile of Babylon to where we are when we pick up the New Testament. They're seeing it as, well, not everything that's written in First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, not all of that kind of fits our expectation looking at the New Testament. Like the New Testament, it's every epistle is included because it teaches kind of the same message. It's the same format. You can tell it was written by Paul or a student of Paul or John or Peter. Or you have the Gospels; they're trustworthy. Well, they're saying, well, we kind of see the same structure of the Jews held all of these books in high regard. It's just whether we want it in the church. And the Protestants fell into this trap of when they had their Reformation, they left the Catholic Church. So at the beginning, these books were still in their Bible. But as they recomposed it, you had a movement in which we don't want to just translate from Greek copies because they're not the oldest. The Hebrew copies are the oldest. And so you go back to the Masoretic text. Well, some say the Masoretic text was written shortly after when the book of Esther would have been written. So, of course, the Maccabees aren't there because that hasn't happened yet. But it's also one of those, if we don't have a Hebrew copy of it, we're probably not including it in our Old Testament because it's hard to say, well, maybe Jim Bob added all that later. And so how can we say it's trustworthy? And so that's kind of how we got the books we have in our Bibles here.
Do the Jews include it in their religious studies and stuff?
Generally, yes. The books that because you have different groups and different nations that have different practices. And so it's kind of similar to how we do our Bible classes. There's some books of the Bible that we wear out all the time in Bible class or every time on Sunday morning. Like we'll wear those books out. And then you have some that, yeah, we have it, but we're not necessarily in it all the time. And so First Maccabees is for a lot of Jews, it's the second, third, and fourth that kind of, they're the ones that, okay, we can just skip over that. And it's kind of like some of those minor prophets. Not everyone's read the minor prophets, and even those that have, they don't read them yearly or even monthly. It's every once in a while. Every once in a while becomes every couple of years, and so that's kind of how they use the Maccabees. But First Maccabees is because it's kind of like their new Exodus, their new, like, this is their Bible hero. And for centuries, that was what they were expecting the Messiah to be. And so now you have a lot of Jews that have come around to say, yeah, it probably was Jesus, but we're too proud to say that now that Jesus was the Messiah. But it's still one of those, like, there's still those groups that say, no, we are looking for a Messiah like Judas Maccabeus. We're looking for a Messiah like David, like Moses, like Joshua, someone who's a major figure, and they'll put Judas right up there with him. So, yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.